Welcome to Defense Mechanism. I'm Zach Stock. Today we're talking about John Adams. Adams was the first vice president and the second president of the United States. Before that, he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and an ambassador on various European missions. He also drafted the world's oldest functioning written constitution, the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. Historian and Adams biographer David McCullough has said that Adams never failed to answer his country's call. On top of all of that, he was a working lawyer who defended the British after the Boston Massacre. We are going to examine what his example of putting principle before politics still means for public defenders. Our guest is attorney and IPDC board member Mike Cunningham, a devoted Adams fan. We'll look at how the founding era pulled Mike into criminal defense and maybe wrestle with the good and the bad of Adams's legacy. Mike Cunningham, welcome to the premiere episode of Defense Mechanism.
Thank you, Zach. Very glad to be here and share all of the great things that there is about one of the best presidents we've ever had and best founders we've ever had, John Adams.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I've always wanted to say that. Welcome to the premiere episode of Defense Mechanism. I feel like the capstone on the career there.
It's the maiden voyage, really. So congratulations to you and to IPDC. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Thank you. Yeah, hopefully it doesn't all end here, right? Before we get in too deep in the nerd out for a little while about the founders and John Adams, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? Where do you practice?
Sure. So I grew up in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, which is Dearborn County. Went to East Central High School, home of the Trojans. After that, attended Purdue University, where I studied history, and that's kind of where I got, the bug for all things history, and more particularly, maybe our founding era. After that, I started working at the State House for the state legislature, which is, I started with an internship there as the policy intern. So in that role, you get to read all the bills that come before session. You are on the House floor every single day. And it just so happened that during that session, 2013 year or so, is when the state legislature was doing the criminal code rewrite and things like expungement. And so I really, truly had a front row seat to the legislative process, but also to a lot of debates around our criminal law. And so that's really, I think, where I started having this realization in my head of like, wow, this is really kind of an interesting area, something I might like to do. So after working there for a little bit, I decided to go to McKinney, attended the evening program, and really knew pretty much right away that I wanted to do defense work.
Yes. So I wanted to ask you that question specifically. When did you know you were a defense lawyer at heart? And did any of the stuff we're going to talk about today have anything to do with it? Did reading the founding generation and the history of the founding era inform your conviction?
I would say I grew up in a pretty conservative household. You respect police officers, you respect law enforcement, you do what you're supposed to do. You do the crime, you do the time. And that always made perfect sense to me. And in a lot of ways, that's never really changed. But when I started to really kind of become aware of, criminal law and kind of how it plays with, our Constitution, I think that's really where I started to have a better appreciation for I think I want to be a defense lawyer, because what I have always believed and felt very strongly about is a strong sense of our founding principles, which is this idea of limited government for the protection of the individual and individual liberty and freedom. And when you really look at our Bill of Rights, we're talking about 10 amendments that are criminal law, right? That's all based in the criminal law. So you've
Right.
got your First Amendment that says, hey, you get to speak about the government and nobody can, put you in jail. Your Second
Hmm.
Amendment rights, which are hotly debated, but those are the ones that say I have the right to defend myself and to defend the freedoms that I have, and that
Hmm.
freedom against tyranny. The Fourth Amendment, which we're going to be talking about a lot, I think, today as we talk about John Adams, is this idea that you have the right to be free from government searches and seizures and to protect yourself in your home. Your Fifth Amendment rights, your right to counsel, your right to due process, all of
Hmm.
these things. And so I'm like looking at this and I'm like, well, why would our framers, these law and order individuals, why would they develop a system that would defend criminals?
Hmm.
And the answer is they did not.
Hmm.
They developed a system and a Bill of Rights um, that really protected the individual from government because what the framers understood better than anyone, and because they lived through it, was that we have been living under a very tyrannical regime in which some king and some person in high places can just say what goes. And, there's really no accountability for them, but they get to, come into my life, tell me what to do, how to live it. I really don't
Hmm.
have anything of my own. We're talking about murder, rape, plunder, things like that.
Hmm.
That really does not make anybody free. There's no freedom of expression in a system like that. So then, when you want to talk about the criminal nature of things, in a very real sense, our colonists, and again, we'll talk about this with John Adams and the Fourth Amendment, people who were living in early America or in the colonies were criminalized for very basic things like paper
Hmm.
products.
Hmm. Yeah.
That was the contraband of the day, and so in order to protect those rights and the rights of the individual, we're talking about setting up a system that again has to put government over here so that individual liberty can flourish. And that
Yeah.
was something that really always attracted me.
Before we get to Adams, the lawyer, I wanted to ask you a more personal question. Like, um, I've s- I'm gonna. There's a quote from Seneca, the old Roman statesman, senator, Stoic. He said that we should all have a person in our minds that we can use, and his quote is, "as a standard against which our characters can measure themselves." Um, is John Adams that person for you, or one of those measures for you?
I think from a sense of political figures, absolutely. There are certainly personal figures in my life that I
Yeah.
would put up there, but when we're talking about from a law perspective, a political perspective, you would have to put John Adams up there probably with just about anyone. And that is because he was such a man of great principle.
Hmm.
And to me, the hardest, I was raised by some pretty amazing people, my mom and dad, who taught me to do what's right, even when it's hard. And that is just kind of to try to serve others and to make everything around you better. But you know, you got when you're doing things that are hard or you're doing things even when they're hard, that can come at great personal expense. And so
Hmm.
that is where you really have to be moored to those personal convictions and do what's right because it's right, not because of where it might get you, in the long run. The results take care of
Hmm.
themselves if you're doing things the right
Hmm.
way.
So,
And I think time and again, you saw John Adams throughout the course of his career being that man of principle. And the more I learn about him and have read about him, the more you kind of like.
yeah, I agree. And the interesting thing about him too is, historians have pointed out and he, I think, acknowledged it in his lifetime that Cicero, the Roman, was his model, who the person he was trying to measure up to. Um, and Adams is famously known in his time for kind of having a high opinion of himself, right? Um, but I've read that he um, really was privately very self-deprecating in his diaries. He was always beating himself up for not measuring up. I need to read more. His diaries have these
Mhm.
entries like, I need to stop, basically paying attention to women and playing cards. He's like, I've got to read more, and I've got a long way to go. And there's a historian, Thomas Ricks. He says, and this is riffing a little bit on what you just said about your family and other personal
Yeah.
mentors. He says that Adams had no personal mentors in his lifetime, unlike the other founders. Like they had friends or teachers or models, but that no one had invested in Adams in that way. And as a result, he had to mentor himself. And that's why he's beating himself up in these diaries. I mean, in other words, he was a lone wolf. And
Yeah.
and I think a lot of defense attorneys can relate to that. And do you agree? And I'm sure you've had mentors, as you just kind of mentioned with your
Yeah.
family. I suspect they're lone wolves too, though, some of them. So can you talk about that a little bit? Like,
Yeah.
why are defense attorneys lone wolves, and who were your mentors?
Yes. So you've said a bunch of different things, and
Yeah.
I don't want to forget all of them because they raise such great points about Adams, particularly, but then also about the individual, what it takes to be a good advocate, a strong advocate.
Yeah.
You mentioned Cicero. Cicero was known in his day as being a great orator, which ultimately is something that really was one of Adam's strong points. But that reminded me of a really awesome professor that I had at Purdue taught rhetoric, and what he talked about was eloquency. This idea of eloquency is a good man speaking well, and or good person speaking well. Um, and that to me is what it takes to be a good advocate. You must be moored to good principles, understanding what the law is and that, hey, we need to do these things because it's the right thing to do. And then we also have to have the capacity, the ability, and the willingness to go that step further to speak well. And it
Hmm.
doesn't mean to be the politician or the salesman or the whatever. The good man speaking well is speaking it in a way that makes sense, that
Hmm.
others can understand so that they too can be persuaded.
Hmm.
And I really think that is so important in what we do as lawyers day in and day out. And yes, so I would say too, Adams may not have had the mentors in his life because he did kind of come from humble beginnings, maybe more so than some of his other.
Hmm.
I mean, his dad was involved in politics and things, but I think there was only one book in the house when he was growing up. So I don't know that he really had the model for like kind of what you do, but he was a determined
Hmm.
man, young man.
Hmm.
Um, which is kind of interesting too. So you have that and that grit and determination to make something of yourself.
Hmm.
The self-deprecating aspect that you mentioned is so important um, because it keeps you humble.
Hmm.
You do always need to check yourself, and you can never get too big or too high on your own self.
Hmm.
But what you said about being an advocate and maybe being lonely at times or things like that actually makes me think of a quote that I kind of use in my preparation for the bar exam. It's a quote by E.O. Wilson, and I'm going to butcher it, but he basically says that you've got to work hard. You're capable of more than you know. The world needs all that you can give. Dedicate yourself to a cause, and prepare to be lonely at times.
Hmm.
I think it was also Justice Scalia that had said at some point over the course of his career that you should have your faith or your convictions to be called foolish at times and be prepared to sit in that.
Mm-hmm.
And what all of those things mean, and particularly for a good advocate and a good defense attorney, is that you will have situations throughout the course of your representation that are going to be damn hard. But what
Mm-hmm.
you know is that your client and your community depends on you. And
Yeah.
it's not always going to be the popular decision to represent a
Mm.
murderer or a
No.
child molester, or someone is accused of something so heinous. A Boston or a excuse me a British soldier on trial in Boston. Those things may not always be popular, but the rule of law requires that you do more, and
Yeah.
that can be a lonely position. But so long as you are doing what is right, you should never, you know it doesn't mean it's
Yeah.
going to be easy, but
No.
having
The
that focus
yeah,
is what
no,
drives you
that
forward.
absolutely. That it reminds me of something that there's a line, and I'm not sitting around reading the Iliad, don't worry, but there is a line in the Iliad that I read in a different book recently. Always fight bravely and be superior to others. Really, I think what they were saying was always fight bravely and do your best. And I
Yeah.
think that's what you're saying. It's a classical virtue. It's been around for a long time, and um, Adams was full of that for sure. And I think that's kind of what you're touching on. Well, you've talked about we've kind of danced around it. Him um, uh, defending the British after the Boston Massacre. So, in a couple of years after the Boston Massacre, that he was at some sort of event where they were kind of rehashing what had happened. So, this is March of 1773, and this is what he wrote in his diary. He said, "The part I took in defense of Captain Preston and the soldiers, the British soldiers, procured me anxiety and obloquy enough." Obloquy is a word we don't get right a lot.
Yeah, yeah.
It was, however, one of the most gallant, generous, manly, and disinterested actions of my whole life, and one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered my country. Judgment of death against those soldiers would have been as foul a stain upon this country as the executions of the Quakers or witches anciently. As the evidence was, the verdict of the jury was exactly right. So you probably agree with his assessment of his own work. So tell us a little bit more about why defending the British is so inspiring to you.
Well, that is, in my estimation, probably really one of the first times that you see a major political figure stepping forward to do the opposite of what you might expect. I don't know if it's contrarian to say that or whatever, but that was a principled approach, and it was the right approach. It was the thing that had to happen, and it was ultimately the thing that I think probably propelled this country in the sense of the rule of law. It was a very real representation. The man in the arena, the person that took on great risk to say, if we want to be a nation of laws and we don't want to be like the other side, right? The British at that point, then here's what we have to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that there is something about that. And so many of us as defenders, I think, are faced with those troubling or anxious types of issues, particularly if you are a lawyer in a small town. I practiced in Southeast Indiana for about 6 years, and it's a small group of people. You see people all the time, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You're not exactly stranger to folks,
Mm-hmm.
and you could be having somebody walk into your office that is the most unpopular person, in the community, and all of a sudden you're the person that's representing them. That's not comfortable
Mm-mm.
to be in.
Mm-mm.
And you need look no further than somebody like John Adams, who kind of set the bar and set the tone to say, no, it's okay. Because
Mm-hmm.
this is what the law is, because the law requires that we don't think about, we shouldn't
Mm-hmm.
think about maybe the personal thing. If justice is really blind, so to speak, then those things can't come in the way. It's either
Yeah.
right or it's wrong.
Yeah, there's an interesting he goes on in that diary entry to say something to the effect of, um, just, yes, they should have been acquitted, and the death sentence would have been a horrible tragedy akin to witch burning, which I think is put a pin in that for a minute, by the
Yeah.
way, that, John Adams was the kind of guy that in the 18th century, as a descendant of Puritans, he knew how wrong that kind of thing
Yeah.
was. I mean, he was kind of modern-ish in a lot of issues, in a lot of ways that many of the other founders were not. And
Hmm.
I think that's a topic for a different podcast. But what he went on to say in the diary was the soldiers shouldn't have been there. They kind of did wrong, but they didn't do the wrong they were accused of,
Yeah.
which I feel like that's all. I mean, our audience is going to get that,
Yeah.
but I don't know that the broader audience gets that all the time. Like
Yeah.
that sometimes we're standing in there for a person who's like, yeah, okay, they did something wrong, but they didn't do this,
Yeah.
and they don't deserve this much punishment. And so I don't know if you got thoughts about that.
So I want to try to approach it this way. So, like, I hear people say, I tell people, well, I'm a defense attorney and I represent people who are accused of crimes. And they say, oh, yeah, that's great. Wow. How do you defend those people? Right. That's the one. But what I ultimately get to is their rationale of like, okay, yeah, well, you're just there to just make sure that they're getting a fair trial. Right. And, that's a really watered down version of what we do. And honestly, in reviewing, kind of going back and refreshing my memory a little bit in some of like the online things about the Boston Massacre and why John Adams decided to represent them, it was, well, he just wanted to make sure that they got a fair trial. And
Hmm.
it's like the assumption there is, or maybe the premise in the argument that I totally disagree with is these people did wrong,
Hmm.
and so you're just making sure that the train doesn't go off the tracks any which way.
True. Yeah.
And
Right.
I take issue with that
Hmm.
because if you really believe in the principles that you're fighting for, then really what you're representing is an innocent person. You are
Hmm.
representing an innocent person unless, not until, unless the government can prove their guilt. And it
Hmm.
has to be that way because if it's not that way, then there is nothing that stops the government from knocking on your door and saying, you're guilty, prove otherwise, right?
Right.
And
So,
so, yeah, go ahead.
so on this point, I want to read something that directly from his argument in the trial that I use as we're talking in our work in the legislature. Um, he said, "It's of more importance to community that innocence should be protected than it is that guilt should be punished. For guilt and crimes are so frequent in the world that all of them cannot be punished. And many times they happen in such a manner that it is not of much consequence to the public whether they are punished or not. But when innocence itself is brought to the bar and condemned, especially to die, the subject will exclaim, 'It is immaterial to me whether I behave well or ill, for virtue itself is no security.'" I think that gets to what you're saying. It's sort of like make sure that the trial's fair, and yeah, I mean,
Yes.
that is the minimum. That's the
Yeah.
floor. Like, make sure everything is fair, but also, and, if a guilty person does go free because the state hasn't met its burden, that's also the system functioning,
Yeah. Well,
according to John Adams, right?
yeah. Well, and according to
And
thousands
according
of
to Mike
years of
Cunningham. Yeah.
and according to
And
thousands of
Zach
years
Stuck.
of law and principle, it has to be that way. Otherwise, there is no such thing as innocence, and there's no such thing as safety. And so when we talk about in this context of narrowing down and saying like, no, it has to be this way, that the government actually has to prove that you did the thing that they say you did, right? And they don't just get to throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. That's a real problem because then it really wouldn't matter, right? Then we're just in a place of like, well, so long as I got to have my day in court, well, I guess we're all good here. You're not
Mhm.
protecting innocence by just making sure that you got your day in court. You're protecting innocence by forcing the state to meet its incredibly high burden. And if they're overcharging on
Mhm.
something or they don't have the elements, then they don't get to convict. They don't get to take away your liberty. That's why it is so, it has to be so high. We have to be so sure. Because really, if we get it wrong, the stakes are so high and the consequences are so dire. And what that means is we do put ourselves in a situation where it's like, well, doesn't matter if I do good or not. They're just going to tell me I committed the crime
Yeah,
anyway. So what's
that's
it
right.
matter? That's no
Yeah.
way to live in a lawful society, and it's no way to live in a free society either.
Yeah.
So this idea of like they might have done something, but they didn't do that, right?
Mhm.
They might have they had their own, you know, it's maybe to use another way of kind of looking at this, the verdict at the end of the day is guilty or not guilty. It's not
Mhm.
innocent, right?
Mhm. Right.
Or guilty.
Right.
Because look, we're human beings. We do things that maybe we shouldn't do. But
Right.
if being stupid is a crime, if being unwise is a crime, if pushing the limits is a crime, we're all in danger, right?
Yeah.
So that's
We do.
where it's like you do have to make sure that you're fitting the elements. And um, I think it's totally fine that Adam said, look, my clients, these people aren't angels, but
Yeah.
they weren't guilty.
Right. And so that brings up another topic about it I wanted to ask you about. I kind of, in preparing for this, I kind of didn't know this point, but came across it in some research that I guess Adams, um, both at the time and by historians subsequently, he's been criticized for refusing, in his defense of the soldiers, to put sort of Boston, the mob of Boston, on trial. Um, he, and we do know that he worked to limit the calling of witnesses, and the goal was, and there was some disagreement with his co-counsel, and the idea being that if we bring on these witnesses to talk about how unruly, how terrible these guys were in Boston, roaming the streets and throwing stuff at British soldiers, and how the unrest had gotten out of hand. If we show that, well, then we'll show that it was okay for these British guys to shoot, um, and um, so they've accused him basically of pulling punches out of fear that he would offend his neighbors and constituents.
Mhm.
Um, but I think that focusing on the incident, his argument was, no, we're going to paint the picture in that moment. We're going to talk about what kind of chaos was going on, and maybe you should talk a little bit more about what we do know of the incident. The chaos that those soldiers faced in the moment was good enough, was bad enough to justify the mistakes that were made when they fired.
Mhm.
I think he made the best choice. In fact, I kind of always think now, I hate it when we're having trials about secondary or tertiary issues instead of like what actually happened here. I mean, I guess sometimes that's all you got. I've always been an appellate lawyer, not a trial lawyer, but because you're a trial lawyer, I want to see, do you agree sort of with his strategic choice and with kind of the idea of focusing on the event itself in general?
Well, so I don't think I knew that particular part until you had sent that to me, that there really was this like strategic disagreement between John Adams, Josiah Quincy, and essentially everyone on the other side. Like,
Right.
everybody kind of thought like, oh, well, we all know what this is, you know. Each side's mad at each other. We're going to just put the whole city on trial, and it'll be that way. As you kind of think about it, this might be I think they call the Sons of the Revolution with Samuel Adams, John Adams'
Hmm.
cousin, who was
Hmm.
probably a part of organizing maybe the Boston Massacre and was
Right.
obviously an ardent opponent of lobsterbacks, redcoats being in his city, and occupying the city, really. And so you can understand that. And obviously, there's this growing tension, which I think we should talk about as we get to the lead up to the Fourth Amendment. But when we're in this place of talking about how do I win this case for my clients, that is a very basic question that you should be asking yourself. And our founder at the criminal defense team, Andy Baldwin, is a legendary trial attorney. What he says is, if you're explaining, you're losing. And I think that's really interesting when you couple that with kind of what you have here. It's a strategic decision, but why don't you just focus on the facts? Why are we going to get down this road when the jury may not want to go down that road, right? The jury here selected could very well be folks like Samuel Adams and the saucy boys that started this rebellion, basically, or this mob. John Adams refers to them as saucy boys.
I was going to clean that up for the audience. That you don't generally use the term saucy boys.
I don't. No, but that's what he refers to them as. But this community is under attack, and they probably don't like the British being there. And so if you rile them up and you're going against the grain that much to say, actually, it's your fault that this happened, I don't imagine that as a trial lawyer that you're going to be bringing a whole lot of people on your side. No. At the same time, if what you are doing, which I think Adams is so eloquent in his closing argument, it's something that everyone should read, but he focuses on the rule of law and this is human nature. You want to be on the right side or the wrong side? If you want to be on the right side, then who could be against an individual defending themselves? If I'm saying that we have to outlaw self-defense, I'm saying that you don't get to take advantage of self-defense. Is that really what you want in this community? You don't want to be placed in a situation where you cannot defend yourself. Sure enough, there is time left to say that exactly this incident is why we shouldn't have standing armies in the streets. But that's a debate that can take place in City Hall. But in this courtroom, where the rule of law lives, that's what we need to focus on. And I thought it was masterful and really kind of shows you the brilliance of John Adams, the trial lawyer, to be like, look, I know you want to focus on those things, and that's really fun and all, but is it helping our clients? And so often, that's what we have to focus on. And as a trial lawyer, I can tell you that it can be very difficult to want to go down these roads, but you have to ask yourself, what is the benefit to my client? It's the age-old adage in cross-examination: never ask one question too many.
Now, you've mentioned Adams and the Fourth Amendment a couple of times, and I'm just going to kind of open-ended throw it to you. Like, what is it about Adams? I assume you're talking about general warrants, and you're talking about how he watched what was the lawyer?
James Otis.
James Otis. Yeah, he watched James Otis just rip the general warrants apart, and was really kind of cemented him on the course to becoming who he was, a founding father. Talk about that a little bit.
You can't tell the story of American independence and the Revolutionary War without talking about the road leading to the creation of the Fourth Amendment, and even before that, this idea of taxation without representation. So I want to start there, because in grade school, we're taught, now the colonists, they were really upset that they were being taxed too much, and by people that lived across the pond, and they had no say in it. And so it was just a difference of opinion, and that's kind of how we got here. And they had their battle cry of no taxation without representation. And that is really only part of the truth. But the real story is a hell of a lot more fun and cool, because what happens is general warrants. That's what we know, the chief evil that we read about in case law. So to kind of distill it down really quickly, the British were in like constant battle with France, and they had amassed this wartime debt, the 7 years war, things like that. And so they had to pay it off. And in order to pay off that debt, what they did is they passed acts like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. And those taxed paper products, paper goods, really, truly anything except for private correspondence, and some books. But playing cards. You want to. We're talking about like legal papers, documentation, basically anything else that you could put on paper is being taxed. You had to put a stamp on it. It's like
Yeah.
really expensive.
People have equated it with, putting a tax on every Google search.
That's
In terms of its ability to affect information flow and how offensive that the colonists would have found it.
100%. Newspapers, pamphlets, advertisement, deeds, diplomas, bills, bonds, legal documents, all of it is taxed. And the colonists obviously have no say. But some people are, some colonists are not paying their taxes, or they're smuggling it in, or they're, what have you. And so, well, how do we enforce this law? Well, writs of assistance. Writs of assistance are the general warrants. And writs of assistance were essentially these broad general warrants that did not have to be sworn to under oath to say, hey, I think this person's breaking the law. It allowed any person with a writ, as long as the sovereign, the king, lived, to effect that warrant, to search anywhere they wanted, anytime, to basically find if someone was breaking the law, to take things from the home, and to basically get to this place where they could reap the benefits of the bounty that they took. And I want to read this quote by Sam Adams. So he's echoing James Otis, who you already mentioned is the person that is kind of John Adams' mentor. But James Otis, argues on behalf of it's like 67 Boston merchants or something like that, saying why this is such an affront on English liberty and common law. And it's really pretty damning. He loses, but that is really what John Adams calls James Otis's argument is where the child of independence was born, in the first act of the revolution. So Sam Adams describes these acts and these enforcements like this, and let me pull it up here. But he says, our homes and even our bedchambers are exposed to be ransacked. Our boxes, chests, and trunks broke open, ravaged and plundered by wretches whom no prudent man would venture to employ even as menial servants. It is safe to say that Samuel Adams would not be a back the blue kind of a guy.
Right.
Right?
Right.
I mean, menial servants, petty tyrants. This is what they thought of these people. And so you get to this place where we're breaking open homes and warehouses, things like that. That's not apparently enough. And so then the British send troops to occupy the streets. That's where you get the lobsterbacks in the streets.
Yeah.
That's where people are walking around the streets of Massachusetts and Boston, and where you were met with this growing tension. Mm-hmm. And that growing tension is directly a cause of unreasonable government searches and seizures, right? That leads to this real true disagreement, if you will, where this mob confronts at some point in 1770, the British soldiers who are kind of defending their turf, if you will, and you have the Boston Massacre. You have the trial. From there, you then have a Minutemen statute that's erected in Massachusetts, where able-bodied men are required at a moment's notice to take up arms to defend the
Hmm.
colony.
Hmm.
And a guy named Thomas Gage, who works for the British, he's like, well, I can't have that. So he calls in more people to go to a place called Lexington and Concord, where there is kind of a cachet. He's also given orders to arrest somebody named John Hancock,
Hmm.
and Sam Adams, people that are kind of part of this whole great storm of things. And he's trying to put out a rebellion. Well, as we know, Paul Revere gives this famous ride and warns them in time, and they're ready for the British. And then you have the shot heard around the world. We
Yeah.
have then the Revolutionary War. We have John Adams, who is instrumental in bringing the Revolutionary War to a close in the Treaty of Paris. He goes over there with Benjamin Franklin,
Hmm.
and they basically broker peace. And from there, John Adams takes his seat in the Continental Congress and is not a backbencher whatsoever. John
Hmm.
Adams, unlike skilled statesmen like Thomas Jefferson, is the guy that is standing up and saying, here is why we need to do these things. And here's
Hmm.
why we need to protect our
Hmm.
rights. And
Hmm.
what he does is he drafts the Fourth Amendment. He draws on other state constitutions. He enshrines it in Massachusetts Constitution, which is the longest running state constitution in the world. Um, and you have today's Fourth Amendment. It's
Yeah.
pretty cool.
Yeah. It's a through line for sure. And there's a lot of interesting through lines. One I want to pick up on before we leave that I think has importance for the modern moment, less about being a lawyer and more about just being a statesman, being a human. And you mentioned Jefferson; it relates to him. Um, this is where I'm going to admit I get a little sentimental, Mike. The So people probably famously know that Jefferson and Adams they died on the same day on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration. Jefferson, the primary author, and Adams on the committee to write the Declaration of Independence. They died on the same day, July 4th. People probably already know, especially if they've listened to Hamilton or seen Hamilton, they at least know that Adams and Jefferson had a tremendous falling out around the election of 1800. They stopped speaking to each other. They had stopped speaking to each other before that, I think, but it was a personal rift as two men could possibly have, powerful, intellectual, important men, as significant a rift as they could have. But they patched it up. People probably maybe they know that too. It's pretty famously they patched it up. Um, Jefferson wrote a letter to Adams. They were getting old, this is in 1820-ish, I think, and um, Jefferson's going on and on about what he knows in this world, what he doesn't know in this world. And here's a quote. I think when it's appropriately set in its context, it's a really impressive thing for one older man to say to another after all that history. He said, "I'm satisfied and sufficiently occupied with the things which are, without tormenting or troubling myself about those which may indeed be, but of which I have no evidence. I'm sure that I really know many, many things, and none more surely than that I love you with all my heart and pray for the continuance of your life until you shall be tired of it yourself." Now,
Pretty
I th-
powerful.
I think that is almost unimaginable. That letter would not be traded between President Biden and President Trump.
Right.
That letter would not be traded. That would not be said. Um, President Obama is not going to send that letter to President Trump anytime soon. Um, And I don't know if you want to say anything about that in just in terms of civility. I know when I first started my practice, when I first was admitted, we were constantly talking about the decline in civility,
Yeah.
24 years ago. Like, do you feel like that's a thing? Do you feel like your adversaries as prosecutors or even co-counsels as a defense attorney, do you feel like that level of I don't know what the right word is, rapprochement is possible?
Here's what I'll say. I have the very great fortune of practicing in Johnson County a lot. It's where my office is in Franklin. This is by far one of the most collegial bar associations I have ever seen. And it does not matter what side of the respective aisle that you're on, whether it's prosecutor or defense, I mean. That is not like that everywhere in this state, which is really unfortunate. Um, sometimes, and it's true in my experience, it's been in the smaller counties. Um, there is a sense of because you're the defense attorney, you have taken on the role of whatever the bad person is accused of, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that really prevents people from seeing the humanity in one another. And it also prevents people from recognizing that if you really believe in the rule of law, that we're actually all supposed to be pulling from the same side
Mm-hmm.
of the rope, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Now, we necessarily are part of an adversarial system. It has to be that way. You can pull as far as you want on that side, and I'm going to pull back 10 times as hard on this side. But at the
Mm-hmm.
end of the day, what it does not mean is that we are actually diametrically opposed.
Right.
Because actually, the state has an interest in protecting innocence. Should,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
And we do too, right? That's all that we're about on this side is ensuring that we are protecting the presumption of innocence and that idea of freedom and safety from the perspective of keeping the government at arm's length.
Mm-hmm.
But if I look on the other side and I say, prosecutor, do you understand that really I'm not trying to make your life difficult at all? What I'm trying to do is represent my client, but in the broader grand scheme of things, I'm trying to represent a system
Right.
that can only thrive when we are really doing this work zealously. Um, I would hope that there is some mutual respect that comes from that. I see that a lot, luckily, in the county that I
Good.
am in.
Yeah, that is
Um,
good. I mean,
like,
it does boil down to the disagree without being disagreeable,
yeah,
to be adversaries without being adversarial. I
yep,
mean, it really does boil down to that. It's really not that. It's
yeah,
really not that um, bold a concept, but I do think it in some ways it does cross the wires of our psychology, which is, if someone fights, fight or
mhm,
flight, right? Like I'm
yeah,
either going to fight back or I'm going to run away. And so you really have to institutionalize that in your own mind. You have to really cement in your own mind that I am not going to treat my opponent this way, right?
well, and I agree with that. I would say that a lot of where I have kind of learned to do that, and I would like to think that I'm that way. We'd all like to think of ourselves in the
Right.
most
For
positive
sure.
light.
Right.
There are, of course, times when I may fall short, but
Oh yeah. Right.
where I draw a lot of that, where you said is like the compartmentalize or institutionalize in your own mind is from sports.
Right.
I
That's
mean,
right.
growing up playing sports, an adversarial system, I could have a best friend on the other team.
Yeah.
But when it is time to play the game, I am not your best friend,
Yeah.
right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
different than what I was just saying. But it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that I lose the love and admiration and respect for my opponent. Not
Right.
at all. It
I
does
agree.
not mean that in the least. What it means is when it's time to lace them up, I am going to kick your ass. That's
Right.
what's going to happen. And guess what? You're saying the exact same thing. And those two things, the iron sharpens iron, is what
Yeah.
has to happen. But at the end of the day, you're supposed to be able to walk away from that and saying, you're doing your job and I'm doing mine. And when we do those things, our system is better.
Yeah.
We don't make our system better when I'm not giving you the respect by letting you win. Maybe
Right.
if you can say it that way. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
I think
How am
that's
I how am I teaching you, and how are you teaching me if we're just in this place of just not respecting each other? We can handle it. We're adults.
right. No, I completely agree. Okay. So, maybe last question or next to the last question, we have to, let's be objective here. You love John Adams. I love John Adams, but we've got to talk about the cranky president who signed the Alien and Sedition Acts. How do you square defender of the British soldiers in Boston with signer of a speech policing law? What is there a way to square that, or is it two different men? One was much older than the other, or is it just politics? What do you got thoughts on that?
Uh, yes. So in the lens of the historical lens of hindsight being 2020, we can see things perfectly now.
Yeah,
Um, Bad idea, right?
right,
It is. Let me be the first to say,
right.
bad
Bold. That's
idea.
bold of you.
To
Yeah.
thank you. I will say, I love free speech, and you should be able to speak against your government, even really nasty, awful, horrible things.
Hot take.
And you shouldn't have to face the consequences of jail or deportation, even for saying something like that. Now, having said that, you have to understand the Alien and Sedition Act, that the one that John Adams signed, in its proper context, which is an infant toddler nation trying to hold itself together. These are people that said in the Declaration of Independence that they are, giving their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor for this independence. They fought really damn hard to create this country. And so before you have Adams as president, what you have is, shocker, Britain and France at war again.
Mhm.
And America's again new, and they're trying to stay neutral. So they're forming treaties with Britain, and all is well there. But then France is like, no, that doesn't work, because then that cuts against something that we had worked out a long time ago.
Mhm.
So then they start seizing American ships. And I hate to go down this road, but we've got to talk about the full context of it. They start seizing U.S. merchant ships. It's not good for business. And so John Adams, it goes on into his presidency, and he's like begging for Congress to do something to help protect. And his opposition is like, nah, we're good. I think we're okay. It's really not that big of a deal. Adams sends a kind of he sent some diplomats or a delegation over to France to say, let's get some peace done. And the French foreign minister at the time says, no, I won't even meet with you unless you pay me $250,000 and a small loan of $10 million before we even start the negotiations. Those are
Mhm.
my demands.
Right.
And Adams is like, nah, we don't negotiate with terrorists. So that might be the first time that you kind of have that happening in American history. And so we asked Congress for help again. And Congress says, well, let's see exactly what they're saying, what the French are saying. So Adams gives them the correspondence, and he doesn't provide the names of these diplomats from France. He instead marks their names as X, Y, and Z. So this is known as the XYZ affair. And
Hmm.
what happens from there is Congress is like, oh, damn, I did not know it was that serious. Here's money for a Navy. So we credit John Adams for creating the Department of the Navy. And
Yeah.
here is authority to go out and start attacking ships, French ships. So now we have a quasi war. Imagine that too, that Congress would give from, or that the
Right.
president would seek permission before.
Ahead of time. Yeah.
Exactly. But anyway, those were
Yeah.
different times.
Yeah.
And so you have this quasi war, which kind of goes on, and that when the ships are attacking, that's 1798. Do you know what happens in 1798? the Alien and Sedition Act is signed into law, because what the president and what the politicians at the time were worried about were French foreign influence, specifically French spies who may try to put out a disinformation campaign, something like that. But when you look at it for what it is, I think I can say not a good idea. I understand the context, but then too, let's think of some of the good things that came from that. You know, this wasn't this statute, the Alien Sedition Act, was not ruled unconstitutional for violating the First Amendment. Do we know why? Because it's well before we had any sort of thing called judicial review. What I think it sparked was a real sense of like, no, this is everything we fought for. We're allowed to speak against our government, and we should, and it's right and it's proper. But so it's before judicial review, before we have this robust kind of First Amendment law. And it's, when I say it's before judicial review, that means it's before Marbury versus Madison,
right,
where we have Chief Justice John Marshall saying it's emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. Do you know who appoints John Marshall? John Adams. So you have, just prior to leaving office, right before Jefferson. So you have a guy that is putting forth, I mean, so consequential, I think, is really what it kind of comes down to.
Yeah.
And anywhere you look, he's the man that nominated George Washington to lead the Continental Army, and then voted for him to become the president. This is the only founder to not own slaves.
Right.
We talked about being revolutionary earlier, talking about the witch trials. What about that?
Right, for sure.
This is a man of great consequence who did things because of principle, and not always just because they were easy. Right.
That's right. Mike Cunningham, I think we should probably end it on that super high note. And I think we really appreciate you bringing your passion for John Adams to the public defense community, being our first guest on defense, hopefully not our last guest on defense mechanism. So thanks a lot. Appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.